Welcome everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, based on depending on where you are. My name is Francesco Giumelli. I'm the coordinator of the Illicit Trade Group and the director of the research team at the Agricola School, Development and Security. I'm very happy today to be introducing Chengyong Xiao from the Faculty of Economics and Business. He's an assistant professor in supply chain management here at the University of Groningen. He's going to be giving us a talk on his expertise on supply chain. And this is one of the webinars that we have monthly to show and create a little bit of an interdisciplinary debate at the University of Groningen and beyond on matters that are related to illicit trade, but also to economics and development. So we're very happy to have Chengyong here with us today. And then, so we're going to have the presentation, and then afterwards we're going to have a Q&A for discussion. Without further ado, Chengyong, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Yes, Francesco, thank you very much for having me. Hello, everybody. This is Chengyong from the Department of Operations from FAB. So the paper I'm introducing, in which we explore the role of public and buyer-driven governance for supplier sustainability development. This may sound a bit vague, but I hope it will get clearer if we go to the next slide. So all my research has been about supply chain sustainability, which means how can big brands orchestrating global supply chains like Apple, Philips, or HP make their suppliers, tier 1, tier 2, even tier 3, to be more environmentally as well as socially responsible, because you might have heard some labor issues like Foxconn suicides back in the 2010s and safety issues like Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh in 2013, I believe, which killed more than 1,300 people. So my research is about how can we make our global supply chains more environmentally and socially responsible. And the whole literature, the stream literature started probably 15 years ago with the assumption that there is a weak regulatory institution environment in many emerging countries, like China, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia. So as a result, buying firms, the big brand owners, has a duty or responsibility of cascading certain social and environmental standards across the supply chains. What they do, most of the global brands articulate certain codes of conduct or adopt third-party codes to promote that the suppliers should comply with those requirements as a condition of supplying those brands. And to monitor the suppliers' progress or compliance, those big brands would involve third-party companies to conduct audits on an annual basis, or maybe 2 or 3 years conduct an audit to check to what extent the suppliers were complying or maybe even making progress with the goal of developing a sustainable global supply chains. That's the model of the so-called buyer-driven governance for supplier sustainability development. But in theory, this model sounds nice, because if suppliers show adequate compliance or improvement in sustainability, they would be rewarded more orders. By contrast, the ones who do not show enough progress, compliance, would see their orders reduced and even terminated the relationship with the global brands. But the reality is quite different. Empirical studies over the past 15 years or so show that most suppliers in many countries are not making consistent or sustainable development, which raises the issue of how effective is the buyer-driven governance. Is it really possible that for buyer-driven governance to develop global supply chains? Well, on the other hand, recently we see growing evidence showing that the countries, emerging country governments like in China, India, are taking more active roles in terms of public governance by exerting coercive pressures, providing tax incentives, and also other forms of support to improve the social and environmental performance of the suppliers within their jurisdiction. So the question is, well, we know that limitations of the buyer-driven governance, probably some of them limitations can be complemented or addressed by a growing public governance. The reality is we don't know. there's some indication that there could be potential complementarity between the two types of governance, buyer-driven on the one hand and public governance on the other hand. But there are also some evidence showing that there could be competition, substituting effect between those two types of governance. So in this research, we are going to explore the interactions between public and buyer-driven governance in shaping supplier sustainability capability development. That's the overarching research question we have here is how will a growing public governance interact with existent buyer-driven governance in shaping supplier sustainability development in emerging countries over time? Is that clear enough? Yeah, that's the overall research question we have. And I conducted 2 rounds of data collection of 9 suppliers in China, all in the consumer electronics industry. 9 suppliers located in different regions of China because the different cities might have different levels of economic development. So you can imagine that for the relatively well-developed regions like in the eastern part of China or in the southern part of China, the governments might be more strict in enforcing labor and environmental protection laws. By contrast, the more inland provinces or cities might be less strict in enforcing those laws. So we selected 9 suppliers, all of them supplying one big brand, which is called a pseudo name Cosmos, located in the Netherlands. And in the 2 rounds, first I visited all the suppliers in 2014 as part of my PhD research. I conducted 51 interviews covering both sides. I had interviewees from the Cosmos side, so the so-called buyers, or so-called supplier sustainability experts. So those are the ones from the buying firm side monitoring the supplier's compliance with the so-called EICC Code of Conduct, which essentially specifies the requirements the supplier to comply with. And on the supplier side, for all the suppliers, I stayed at each supplier for 2 to 3 days to interview the top managers like general manager, HR manager, finance manager, but also talk to some workflow workers to understand from their perspective what are the issues they were struggling with regarding sustainability. So that was the first round, which was part of my PhD research. And interestingly, in 2016 or 2017, around that time, the Chinese government started to enforce the laws, enforcement on labor protection as well as on environment protection. So there was a good change in the dynamics or the institutional environment somewhere in 2016, 2017. So we decided to conduct a second round of data collection around 2019, roughly 4 years ago already. So I revisited all the 9 suppliers on the site. Again, I tried to interview the key informants on both sides, buying firm side as well as the supplier side. So for this round, I conducted 40 interviews, but also in both rounds of data collection, I also collected secondary materials, like, for example, third-party audit reports, because every year Cosmos would commission a third-party audit company to check how good or bad the suppliers are doing in terms of compliance with EICC Code of Conduct. Besides those materials, I also collected from an NGO, which is called IPE, Institute for Public Environmental Affairs, which also independently collects information about the suppliers, particularly environmental violations. So that's give you an idea of how much data we have collected in those 2 rounds of data collection, basically close to 100 interviews and several hundred pages of secondary materials. Well, if you have any questions in this, please feel free to interrupt me at any point in time, okay? And so through analyzing the qualitative data, we could see what are the key elements of the buyer-driven governance. The first element is a compliance pressure. So the buying firms were formulating their program or the requirements as a condition for the supplier to supply the buying firm. So if the supplier does not adequately meet the buying firm's requirements regarding labor protection and environment protection, the supplier could face reduced orders and or maybe even being completely phased out from the supplier's supply base. From the buying firm's supply base. But besides exerting pressures by, for example, organizing audits, monitoring, etc., the buying firms were also providing more support in terms of knowledge sharing activities. For example, they would send their supplier sustainability experts to the supply site to check what are problems they have regarding health, safety, environment protection, and those experts would provide potentially cost-effective advices, suggestions to the suppliers to address the issue. So it's more hands-on, supportive approaches compared to simply sending out third-party auditors to check the supplier's compliance. And the third element is more substantial, actually. It's more long-term oriented. So the buying firm would select a few strategic suppliers that have a long-term relationship with the buying firm to engage them into so-called supplier sustainability development programs, like productivity improvement, lean manufacturing, and automation programs. The intention is to increase the suppliers, for example, slack resources in terms of financial as well as managerial resources, so that those suppliers can be making more substantial improvements rather than simply going for quick fixes for the issues that are identified by third-party auditors. So those three are the main elements of the so-called buyer-driven governance, which is not very surprising. This has been reported in the literature. What was interesting was to see in this context, the public governance in Chinese different regions, what has been done to promote suppliers' sustainability improvements. The first one, not surprising, is regulatory pressures. Governments at various levels were promoting law enforcement so that they would inspect the suppliers, sometimes even with unannounced inspections. Suppliers that in certain regions, that the suppliers who were found to have seriously violated the law on labor protection, particularly on environmental protection, would have faced very serious consequences like hefty fines. And in some cases, the factory could even be suspended operation for 1 or 2 months. That has a very serious consequence for the suppliers. What was interesting was that besides regulatory pressures, those local governments were also providing knowledge sharing activities to their suppliers within their restriction, particularly when there's a new law or regulation being passed at the central government level or at the regional level. Many government organizations like labor protection bureaus and environmental protection bureaus may organize training sessions or policy briefing sessions to introduce what this new policy or new law imply for the manufacturers within their jurisdiction. So those are more knowledge sharing, more supportive activities. What's most interesting was that in certain regions, not all in Chinese cities, the governments were also offering monetary and non-monetary incentives for suppliers to become more sustainable and become more socially and environmentally responsible. Like in one region, the local government linked the supplier's environmental performance to the access to low-interest loans. So the suppliers, for example, that have complied all the requirements on on environmental protection would be granted access to low-interest loans from several local banks. By contrast, the suppliers who could not meet all the requirements, who had any environmental violations or issues, would be denied access to those low-interest loans. So those are monetary incentives. But also in other regions, local government were quite creative, I say, providing non-monetary incentives by giving certain awards for a benchmark enterprise to promote this supplier to have more visibility to the public or to the other customers. And the last one of the public governance is that governments also initiated certain development programs for certain suppliers within their jurisdiction, because certain suppliers have, for example, quite substantial environmental and health risks. And one supplier was producing PCB boards, so the printed circuit boards, which are used basically in all electronic products. And the production process of this kind of products are very energy intensive and also very polluting. So some governments in the southern part of China offered support to their suppliers to involve them in certain development programs by engaging, for example, third-party, more professional service providers who could visit the suppliers, look into the production process to identify the room for improvement. Likewise, another supplier was producing lamp bases. It's like a metal processor. There's a lot of health and safety risk in that supplier. The local government also involved another institute to help the supplier to identify where are the risks, where are the health hazards. So they came up with improvement plans for the suppliers by engaging. Of course, the government officials may not have the expertise by themselves, but they could get third-party professional service providers on board to help the suppliers to develop. So those are the two major, let's say, external influences. The first one is buyer-driven governance, which, as I said, mostly we reported in the literature. But what is new in our context, like various supports or pressures exerted by public governance, so the governments in China at various levels. So what we see from the supplier side was that they were engaged in different responses. To be more precise, they engaged in different learning activities. The first one is not surprising, so-called first-order learning activity, which essentially means the suppliers were looking for quick fixes for issues identified by external stakeholders. Whenever a third-party auditor or government official identified a non-compliance, the suppliers would be quick in finding, okay, we found a solution, but how effective or how sustainable that will be, nobody bothered. And for this type of learning behavior, there's, of course, knowledge acquisition and also dissemination, but mostly through management teams at the functional management level. And there's very little learning activity or knowledge acquisition, dissemination at a lower level, ground level, to workshops, to the managers at the line production level. That's first-order learning. By contrast, certain suppliers engaged in more higher-order, so-called second-order learning activities. For example, the suppliers would seek more fundamental solutions to thorny sustainability issues. Like the example I mentioned about printed circuit boards, it's a very energy-intensive and also very polluting process. There are actually no quick fixes to this problem. You have to develop new products and make heavy investments into new water purification system and train employees to operate the system properly. So that's different from first-order learning, which is basically looking for quick fixes. And those suppliers who engage in second-order learning also organize much more systematic and regular internal training and auditing programs. So besides coping with the audits organized by their customers or the governments, those suppliers would even involve third-party auditors by themselves to conduct quarterly or yearly audits to identify any health and safety risks within their operations. So which relates to the third element as well. So those suppliers proactively engaged external professional service providers to look for fundamental solutions to the thorny issues they were struggling with. So those are the main elements we have identified from the qualitative data analysis. What's interesting is, so let's going back to our research question. It's about how a growing public governance can interact with the existent buyer-driven governance in shaping supplier sustainability development. Of course, the expectation widely shared among scholars and practitioners is that with a growing public governance, those buyer-driven governance would become more effective. Suppliers would engage in more substantial improvement in the long term. Well, we do find certain evidence to support this kind of expectation, but we also found something which is quite surprising, which I will show you here. So regarding interaction or complementarity between those two governance mechanisms here on my left-hand side, we have buyer-driven governance and the public governance. So what stands out in the first place is the effectiveness of the monetary and non-monetary incentives like awards, access to low-interest loans provided by local governments. Because this is mostly missing in the buyer-driven governance, even though in theory, all buyers would formulate the program as if suppliers comply, they would get more orders. If they do not, they would see their orders reduced. But in reality, that doesn't happen. So without the monetary and non-monetary incentives provided by the government, actually most global brands were not really offering incentives for suppliers to become more sustainable. So in 2 or 3 Chinese cities, the suppliers we located, we found that the government, when they have offered monetary or non-monetary incentives, this can actually increase the supplier's willingness to transition from a very basic first-order learning, which means quick fixes, to second-order, more substantial improvement, second-order sustainability learning. So this kind of interaction is essentially complementary. So the public governance is offering something which is missing in the buyer-driven governance. And the effects of this governance interaction mechanism is that, so with the provision of incentives, along with the compliance pressures exerted by global buyers and local governments, suppliers become more willing to engage in higher order learning activities. That's the first mechanism we have identified. And the second mechanism is that, so in the first place, Cosmos or Case Company as a global brand were offering knowledge sharing activities to suppliers to support their development. And all suppliers appreciate that. They interpret it as a signal that the buyer is committed to long-term relationship with the supplier. Right? That's a positive signal and a positive interpretation. Well, with the government support as well, when the local government also provided similar support, the suppliers also felt being supported, also felt that the local government has interest in the long-term prosperity, long-term development of the suppliers. So when one supplier perceived positive signals from both their major customer as well as from their local government, they also become more committed to sustainability development. And they also become more willing to transition from first-order learning to second-order learning. So the nature of this mechanism is like synergistic reinforcing. So certain elements which were already acting or being effective in a buyer-driven governance is further reinforced by the supportive elements of the public governance. That's the second mechanism, which we call it strengthening long-term commitment, particularly suppliers' long-term commitment to sustainability development. That's the second mechanism. And the third mechanism is quite surprising, I'd say, because in the whole literature which I am familiar with about supply chain sustainability development, that's been long time a call for local governments or governments in emerging countries to play a more active role, to enforce the law on labor protection, environmental protection, health and safety, with the expectation that when those local governments become more active, suppliers will automatically become more sustainable. So one of the indications of a growing public governance is more compliance pressures through on-site inspections, fines, and or even threat of shutdown. But what actually we found is that this is not working in the way people have been expecting. When suppliers are experiencing a lot of compliance pressures to, in certain cases, very overwhelming level. Like I have one supplier located in Shanghai. By the time of my first visit in 2014, it was located in a very lively industry zone with probably 50 manufacturers located in the same place. But by the time of my second visit in 2019, the supplier was the only one still functioning in that industry zone. All the rest were shut down because the other suppliers could not fully comply with the government's requirements on labor protection, health and safety, environment protection. So you could easily see the increased compliance pressure. But when it comes to effect, it didn't make the supplier more eager to improve or more eager to transition from first-order learning to second-order learning, because the supplier felt no future in this in Shanghai city like this, because they interpret from the increased, to some extent, overwhelming compliance pressure that the local government is not really welcoming those type of manufacturers to stay and to develop. They are labeled as so-called low-end manufacturers. So the pressures exerted by the government are not in any way contributing to the supplier's long-term development. but it's more like an overshadowing. It has an overshadowing effect on what Cosmo has been doing, supporting suppliers development. Because in the presence of very high, overwhelming level of complex pressures exerted by the local government, the suppliers become even less willing to transition from first-order learning to second-order learning, to seek fundamental solutions. What those suppliers were considering was relocating to some other places in China which do not have such high environmental standards. So this might be a bit surprising. China is one country, but there are quite substantial differences across the regions and provinces in terms of law enforcement. So like the supplier that we're referring to, it's located in Shanghai, but by the time of my second visit, it has already relocated most of its manufacturing activities to a neighboring province in Jiangsu province, in particular in the northern part of Jiangsu province, which is economically less developed compared to Shanghai. The similar phenomenon was also observed when we visited a supplier located in Shenzhen. The government was eager to enforce the law on health and environmental protection, but that was not driving the suppliers to improve, but it was simply driving the supplier away to a Jiangsu province, economically less developed compared to Shenzhen. So that's the third mechanism, probably the most surprising, at least for me and also my co-authors. The fourth and last mechanism is that there's a certain level of substitution between the supplier development programs offered by the buying firms, in this case Cosmos, and the supplier development programs offered by government. The fact is that on paper, development program sounds nice. It's cooperative in nature. So suppliers would be willing to join those development programs offered or initiated by their customers. But in reality, it isn't like that. Many suppliers were hesitant in joining the development programs offered by their customers for all sorts of reasons. The first one is about there has been a doubt about whether those programs can be really effective in improving their productivity, like resources, and eventually social and environmental performance. So many suppliers had doubt because their brand couldn't give them a very clear example that those programs did work. And second, also because of the power imbalance between buyers and suppliers, even if the so-called development programs have worked, many suppliers had doubt how much benefit they could retain for themselves. Because from their previous interactions, buyers tend to be very aggressive in taking away the benefits generated by the so-called development programs, right? And the third concern was also when a supplier engages in a development program with a customer or a brand, it means opening itself almost completely to managers from the customer side. Many suppliers had concern of sharing or showing their shortcomings, showing their limitations to their customers. That's why in 2012, when Cosmos initiated the so-called IDH program to trying to fundamentally address the labor issues in the supply chain, they had a huge challenge to overcome to convince suppliers to participate. That was what I observed in 2014. But what was interesting is by the time of my second visit in 2019, certain suppliers which was hesitant in joining the development program offered by Cosmos were joining the similar programs offered by the local government. Why? Because of the concern that I just mentioned. The suppliers did not have similar concerns regarding local government. But also, I think it was one big reason is that the local government, because of its influence, because of its power, they could involve third-party professional service providers to actually carry out such a development program. And buying firms, particularly Western buying firms in China, they are not in such a position to get this type of service providers on board to provide suppliers with very effective improvement plans or suggestions. But also, suppliers did not have the concern that the local government would take away their benefits generated from those development programs. So this mechanism is more substitutive, in a way also complementary, that the key element of a growing public governance is offering suppliers alternatives of collaborative stakeholder engagement. And when both buying firms as well as local governments are offering such long-term development programs to suppliers, that can strengthen the supplier's ability to transition from first-order learning to second-order learning in sustainable capability development. So this is more also complementary. So in conclusion, we can see 4 main types of interaction between buyer-driven governance and public governance. So some of them are kind of conforming to expectation, like the first mechanism is complementary. Second one is between the knowledge sharing activities on both sides. It's synergistic reinforcing. But there's also substitutive effect, and also the last one, the mechanism 4, is overshadowing. That too much complex pressures from the local government, which is not accompanied by collaborative efforts from local government, can overshadow the effect of the buyer-driven governance in fostering supplier sustainability development. So in doing so, I think our finding makes 2 main contributions to the literature. The first one is that we have identified the transition from the first-order learning to second-order learning as a key process that links external influences on the one hand and supplies capability development on the other hand. That's a key contribution to the literature. And the second contribution is that those 4 mechanisms jointly, we are providing much more nuanced insights into the effects of public governance on the effects of buyer-driven governance. Because as I said, there's a high expectation in the literature among supply chain scholars that a growing public governance is the eventually necessary to lend support to buyer-driven governance, which has been shown to be of limited effectiveness so far. So what we found is more nuanced, and also showing that it's not always reinforcing or supportive of buyer-driven governance. There could also be conflicts that can hinder the supplier's long-term development as well. So basically, that's my presentation, and so I'm ready to take any question you might have about my research. Thank you for your attention so far.
I want to thank you, Chengyong, for this very interesting presentation. This really fits well under the Agricola School for Sustainable Development here at the University of Groningen, because it allows us to basically discuss how development works, and especially how sustainable development and how the supply chain and the sustainability of supply chains functions is really a theme that fits well under the objective and the focus of the Agricola School. So we would like to thank you again for this presentation. In line with the policy, now we will stop the recording, thanking for listening, and we will move on to the Q&A. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca.